as a 12-year-old boy, yeah, I think there's something to it. But someone, if they're real, obviously someone solved that, and it'll happen. And then, of course, years go by and you become an adult, and nothing did happen. And at some point, somebody gave me a book on the course of my travels. It was called Alternative 3, and he was a very, very smart, intelligent man. And we had just sort of gotten off the beaten track on our conversation, and he pulled this book out and said, "This is fiction written. This is fact written as a fiction." And so I took that with me and I read it, and it was, written by a British, also a real journalist called Leslie Watkins, a Fleet Street journalist back in 1978. And it was based on an English show, a science report show, where they had kind of done a spoof, a mockumentary about a colony on Mars, a breakaway civilization. And Leslie decided to, on his publisher's advice, take that story and build on the script of the TV show and go in depth into it. And as it turns out, he seemed to have stumbled on something because his phones are being tapped. He was being shadowed. People were telling him that his phones were tapped and things were being intercepted. And he realized that he'd stumbled on maybe a forbidden truth. He was even getting calls from politicians. And so in the end, when I was looking for material to make a film many years later, I was watching a broadcast on the internet, and I stumbled on two people that were talking about having been recruited for a Mars colony. And I'm like, wow, okay, is this really real? Because it was, as far as I knew, it was just fiction. And so I decided to pursue that story, and I made a film out of it called Packing for Mars. And I teamed up with Tanya Maidenford at Screen Addiction early in the process. The two of us became kind of a Scully and Mulder. She had a lot of contacts into the UFO field. And so, between the two of us, we kind of mapped it out and put it together. And then in the course of making that film, I ran into Bill Ryan and Carrie Cassidy of Project Camelot. And they were familiar with many of these whistleblowers. In fact, with their help, they turned me on to some great people. And I actually, after I left Los Angeles, we ended up having Bill Ryan come stay for a while in my apartment in Salzburg. And we got to know, some more sort of crazy stories, because those two people were also kind of like the Scully and Mulder of the disclosure field. And it was Bill that talked about Project Looking Glass, something called Project Looking Glass, which was a time viewing technology. And Carrie Cassidy had done an interview.
Like remote view. And what year is this that you went with?
This was 2010 when I interviewed Bill and Carrie. It was my first round of filming. And then Bill ended up at my apartment in Europe, and 2 years later, for New Year's actually. And so I heard about Looking Glass through Bill Ryan and through Tanya Maidenford. And so essentially that was something in the back of my mind always. And then there was a guy called Bill Wood who had been interviewed by Carrie Cassidy about Project Looking Glass, claiming to have been called into the project early at the end of the last century, early 2000s, to solve a problem that they were having. And that was that there was a problem with their project. The Looking Glass project was that all the times seemed to stop. They couldn't look past 2012, and there was some event, and that event was the awakening of human consciousness, which was basically threw a wrench in the plans of the cabal, and then it was over. And then we were all enlightened, and we all lived happily ever after. And it was supposed to happen on December 21st, 2012, the big date that the Maya, of course, predicted we were going to have. That what people said the Maya, which they falsely interpreted, by the way. Anyway, so that came and went, and many years went by, and now here we are, 2022. And I was researching actually something about the Ukrainian war pertaining to Zelensky, actually, totally non-related. And I was on, one of his on a YouTube channel of a particular journalist who had kind of bunkered himself in Ukraine, in Kiev, and then later in Kharkiv, and was doing like one-man apartment style handy journalism and reporting on the real situation that was happening. And
is that Lira?
Yeah, exactly. Gonzalo Lira, right? So I was looking on his Telegram channel, and kudos to him if he's listening. He's a good guy. A very smart man. And I was looking on his Telegram channel, and all of a sudden, and I was researching a couple of interesting videos that had been dropped that were being claimed to be shot in the Ukraine about these mercenary soldiers from America that had just kicked the asses of the Russians, and and I looked at these, and there was he did a whole video on the fact that there was 3 viral videos that all went
Yeah.
they went viral all about Ukraine. They're all shot in different locations, but they were said to happen in different locations, but they were all shot in that same location. Being a filmmaker, I was interested. So that's what brought me to his Telegram page. That was a little side note there.
Can I ask you a question before we
Yes.
move forward? For Project Looking Glass, who's behind that? And I thought that they couldn't see past 2030.
Well, as I was looking onto his Telegram channel, there was a little message that said Looking Glass Guardians. And I was like, what is this? Because I knew about Looking Glass. I clicked on it. It brought me to a YouTube channel.
Mm.
And it was a YouTube channel by a group called The Guardian, calling themselves the Guardians of the Looking Glass. And they had these videos up there, and the videos were describing themselves as being ex-insiders, military insiders that had been involved in working on Project Looking Glass. And being that I knew a little bit about Project Looking Glass, I was very interested. And I began to read their video transcripts, and I realized that they were talking about things that had a basis in reality. In fact, what was interesting about them is they began adding elements or details to the story that nobody had ever covered before. And the main character of the Looking Glass project, always up to now, had always been kind of Dan Boorish, and Bill Wood being the sort of the most played video out there, still floating around the blogosphere. Still, many people believe that his story is the true story. But the Looking Glass Guardians were telling a different story. And they were saying that the timeline didn't end in 2012, but the timelines ended in 2030. And the other aspect of their story that differed from Bill Wood's story was that it wasn't just going to go out like we were going to all become enlightened and live happily ever after. Goodbye, cabal. No, it was actually quite the opposite. The odds were much, much more in favor of those people, of the timeline that those people that were in charge of the project were running, than for the sovereignty and freedom of civilization. Although it wasn't impossible, the odds were strongly against it, and they laid out a series of reasons why. And they also laid out, the other timeline. They basically laid out 2 timelines. One timeline was the negative timeline, which was the one I call the transhumanist artificial intelligence timeline, and the other one is the timeline of the mass consciousness awakening, the quantum evolutionary leap, which has been predicted by indigenous people all around the planet, and which has been kind of what people are in the awakening or new age or whatever community you want to call it are kind of imagining that we're going to end up on. However, what they said made a lot of sense, because I took a look at the world around me. We had just started, early days of the Ukraine conflict, and what they were, and there was a mass another big subject in the world was forced vaccinations, mandatory vaccinations, right? And all these things were laid out in the blueprints of what they were talking about in terms of events that were going to start happening, building to 2020 to 2030, upon which essentially all the timelines would converge. And that caught my interest, and that was what I decided to go public on. I wrote a story about it. I published it in a German a news blog. I put it up on the Project Avalon, and John Noland of Inspired Channel just happened to stumble on that German news portal because he knows Jan von Helsing, who's the guy behind it, and decided he had to get in touch with me. So he did. He got me on his show. We talked about it, and the whole subject of timelines and Looking Glass and Chronovisor and time travel, it just exploded. And so here we are about 2.5 months later, and it's become a really hot topic because it's highly relevant, and the Guardians of the Looking Glass are extremely controversial.
They are very controversial. So I came across those videos not knowing that much about the original Project Looking Glass. I'm still I'm fuzzy on who is that, the military? Is it the government?
Yeah, it's basically the kind of people that work on government projects as contractors that aren't really public faces. These are insiders. They work behind the wall of secrecy. And yeah.
And then so coming across these videos with the synthesized voice, and then they were asking for people to share the videos on behalf of them, which I have to say was, oh, that's a great gimmick to help things go viral. And then they requested for people to email them, and then from my understanding, they were attacked, I think, on Proton Mail, which I've learned
Right.
since then from others that is not a secure email service.
Right.
So is that correct? What is
Yeah,
your
there's a whole story. There's a whole story to that Guardians of the Looking Glass thing.
is it too much
You
to
just
go
jumped in at the
into?
last, you just threw in the last couple of details of it. But yeah, I mean, you asked me why I would do the Tale of Two Timelines webinar, and it was because I opened my mouth when I was on John Nolan. I didn't know how much of an audience he had. I'm used to doing a lot of interviews, and when you're in these fringe topics, you always have a fringe group, anywhere from 80 to maybe, if you're lucky, 8,000. I didn't realize it was going to be 800,000 or something that was going to watch it, right?
Wow.
So and I said just offhandedly, hey, I have all this research I've been gathering for years and years, decades really, and I should do a webinar on this thing, right? Opening my big mouth. And then I got like 500 emails asking me to do the webinar. And then I guess I had to follow through. So I had an excruciating next month, kind of not only just figuring out how to piece together a cohesive, interesting, and well put together webinar, but also where to put it, how to put it, where to, what platform. And it was unnerving. And but I managed to do it. So I'm happy. I'm proud of myself that I pulled it off. But yeah, I mean, that's I'm so glad, because really the webinar has so much material in it that is so relevant to what's going on right now, that it's really become a lot less about just who the Looking Glass Guardians are. I mean, they are a chapter in this story. And the jury's out on who they really are. No one's ever really come forward and said, I'm the Looking Glass Guardian here. So people think that they're a psyop. They think they're a crypto scam. Some, people, and people think they're real. See, my conclusion was they had so many sync points, Miriam, in their material that were tied into real, bona fide, factual things I could trace to things in my research, that if it was a psyop, or if it was a fake or something, I mean, they'd really have to be brilliant. I got to say, I got to hand it to them there. However, in this modern day and age of disclosure and of being an information activist, or whatever you want to call it, people they call themselves light warriors. I want to stay away from warriors. I like light activists better. But if you have to realize that there's so much of bombardment in the information sphere of misinformation, false information, false mixed with true, and true mixed with false, right? That it's become so hard to navigate really what is true and what is false. So we shouldn't get hung up on it anymore about whether something is true or false. We should look at the data for what it is and analyze and break it down and try to make sense of it like a puzzle piece. And we can throw out the stuff that mean nothing. And we can actually, because we're given clues from the universe in all sorts of fashion, all means of hints and clues. And it could be, the most unlikely places where you get a little hint or a confirmation of something that you've just learned about, that gives you the indication that it's true or not. So that's really kind of what it became. It became this quest of putting out and mapping out all these puzzles. And one of the pieces of the puzzle, of course, or a big piece of it, and the foundation of the Tale of Two Timelines webinar, is the Looking Glass Project, which has a whole history going back really all the way to 1947, possibly even earlier, but let's just say starting with Roswell. And it had to do with those beings that were piloting those ships that began crashing, starting with Roswell and moving forward in time. And that led to the whole concept of timelines and timeline wars. So, and one of the groups that was, of course, primarily involved in that is a group called Majestic 12, which I'm sure people listening to this have heard of that name, or Magi, or the Majestic. They have different, words that they go under. And well, they used to be. I mean, they've changed. They're now, under a different umbrella. However, what you find out when you go through that material, the only available material that's out there, which has been authenticated, talks about not only who was involved, the names, what their jobs were, their designations, but their strategy. And one of their strategies was deliberately stated, and the guy who had that job was a guy called General Twining, and his job was to infuse the information field, especially with respect to UFOs and ufology, with misinformation.
Right.
And he's been doing that since those, you know, since the 50s, right? So you can imagine 70 years have gone by, how much of that disinformation has grown into trees of stories that have absolutely no foundation in reality. But I think anybody that's honest with themselves, who's a serious researcher in ufology, is plagued by the same problem, that you realize there's so many disinfo agents and shills in that group of people to make it difficult to try and find the truth. So we can never be certain. And so it's always important to take all these sync points, as many as you can, line them up and try to kind of make sense of it. And that's what the Tale of Two Timelines webinar is about.
Beautiful. I want to say, as far as their tactic, I call them tries, truth mixed with lies. And Marshall McLuhan talked about information glut. And I think that's part of the feeling of a quickening, is that there's so much. I think you've talked about information density. And if you have, there's a lot of people that are content producers today that are saying a lot of truth, but then they mix it with lies. And I think that that is a tactic in this warfare, especially if you study Tavistock and you realize how the tentacles are on both sides, and they infiltrate all these regional groups. And then if you repeat the lies over and over and over again, well, you know, abracadabra, it becomes the truth. And we're seeing that every day in the mainstream news. And if someone is not paying attention, I believe, from the get-go to a story, that the gaslighting is so immense. I mean, if we look at the deadly insurrection, if we look at George Floyd, then we see this. And if you talk about this, I think in part one, if our foundation of history is based
Yes.
on a lie, and then we create all of our beliefs as to who we are as a society or as an individual,